a Douglas DC-9 passenger plane struggled through the violent storm, attempting to land on St. Martin Island. The pilot tried again and again, but could never successfully locate the runway. The plane's fuel was about to run out. Helpless, the pilot had no choice but to turn toward the sea, attempting to reach the next nearest airport. However, they ultimately failed to reach their destination. Let us take time back to the day of the accident and revisit the story of Antilles Airways Flight 980. May 2, 1970. A Douglas DC-9 passenger plane was scheduled to land at New York's Kennedy International Airport. This aircraft belonged to a U.S. airline then known as Overseas National Airways. By 1970, Overseas National Airways had already expanded its operations into the Caribbean, partnering with KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, its local branch in Curaçao, and Antilles Airways. Antilles Airways was established by KLM in the Netherlands Caribbean colonies as a hub to serve routes across the Americas. Their aircraft appearance was nearly identical to KLM planes in Europe. By the late 1960s, KLM had transferred most of its shares to the Netherlands Antilles government, which took over management and cooperated with other airlines to maintain the air link between St. Martin Island and New York. Although Antilles Airways operated its own fleet, it did not have aircraft capable of flying non-stop to New York. Therefore, Overseas National Airways proposed to charter its DC-9 aircraft for the route. While the DC-9 technically had the capability for non-stop flights, this route pushed the aircraft to the very limits of its range. If the aircraft encountered headwinds, was overloaded, or faced any other unexpected situation, it would need to make a refueling stop en route. Fortunately, Bermuda was located along the flight path and could serve as a planned intermediate stop. Overseas National Airways had already planned to equip this DC-9 with an auxiliary fuel tank to extend its flight time and range, but by the time of the accident, this modification had not yet been completed. Nevertheless, this DC-9 was still chosen to operate Flight 980 from New York to St. Martin Island. The aircraft was named Caribbean Queen. According to the charter agreement between Overseas National Airways and Antilles Airways, the aircraft and pilots were provided by Overseas National, while the cabin crew was supplied by Antilles Airways. The captain for this direct flight was 37-year-old Percy DeWitt. He was a former United Airlines pilot with a total of 12,000 flight hours. He had been flying this DC-9 for about a year. The first officer was 25-year-old Harry Evans, with 3,500 hours of flight experience. Just 2 weeks before the accident, he had passed his final proficiency check on the DC-9. Also on board was a navigator, 35-year-old Neil Hart. When the captain arrived at the airport, he discovered that the company had issued a notice regarding fuel requirements for the New York-St. Martin route. The notice emphasized that the expected remaining fuel upon arrival must be at least 7,000 pounds, approximately 3,175 kilograms. This requirement was set to comply with aviation regulations on fuel carriage. An aircraft must not only carry enough fuel to complete the planned route, but also sufficient alternate fuel in case of diversion. In the Caribbean region, alternate airports were not difficult to find. Almost every island had an airfield of varying capacity. In addition, the aircraft had to carry reserve fuel, typically about 10% of the trip fuel, to cover ground taxiing, auxiliary power unit operation, and additional airborne time if needed, ensuring the flight remained within safe limits. This combination of requirements was what pilots referred to as the total fuel load. According to the notice, if fuel consumption estimates during the flight suggested that the remaining fuel upon arrival at St. Martin would fall below the 7,000-pound minimum, then the flight was required to make a refueling stop en route. The captain and crew performed the necessary calculations and checks. They estimated a total fuel requirement of 28,000 pounds, enough to sustain about 4 hours and 34 minutes of flying. On that day, at 10:15 a.m., fueling was completed, with a total of 28,900 pounds of fuel added, according to both the aircraft's fuel gauges and ground records. With the fuel tanks now full, the aircraft's projected remaining fuel at arrival was above the 7,000-pound minimum requirement. This meant that the flight would not need to make a refueling stop, but instead, the DC-9 would fly non-stop to the Caribbean. During boarding at Kennedy International Airport, it was discovered that although some minor maintenance items had already been signed off, the intercom system between cockpit and cabin was not functioning properly. Aside from this issue, the aircraft had no other technical defects. The captain checked the minimum equipment list, MEL, to determine whether the intercom system was required for dispatch. He found that it was categorized as equipment that could be temporarily inoperative. Although dispatching without the intercom system was considered a minor inconvenience, investigators later discovered that this issue would have far more serious consequences. At 11:02 a.m., Antilles Airways Flight 980 pushed back from the gate, and at 11:14 a.m., it departed from Kennedy Airport. On board this flight were 57 passengers and 6 crew members, a total of 63 people. 1 hour after takeoff, Flight 980 encountered turbulence. With worsening weather ahead, the pilots began to adjust their course to avoid the most severe conditions. At that time, weather at St. Martin was already deteriorating badly. The entire Caribbean region was being ravaged by a violent storm. According to historical weather data from that day, the Caribbean was under the influence of a cold air mass or low-pressure system from the north. This weather pattern created thunderstorms, heavy rain, strong winds, and visibility reduced to just a few miles. At that moment, Flight 980 was about to pass over Bermuda, cruising at an expected speed of Mach 0.78 and an altitude of 29,000 feet. At this point, the captain decided to reduce speed to Mach 0.76, believing this to be a more efficient cruising speed for a long-distance flight. However, he chose to remain at 29,000 feet. By now, the aircraft had already burned off some fuel and was lighter, which would have allowed the pilots to climb to a higher cruising altitude. But instead, they chose not to climb, and in fact made the opposite decision. Generally speaking, flying at higher altitudes is more fuel efficient, since the air is thinner, molecular density is lower, drag is reduced, and less thrust is required, leading to better fuel economy. 2 hours after takeoff, Flight 980 encountered additional turbulence. The crew requested clearance from air traffic control to descend in order to avoid the rough air. After approval, the aircraft descended in 2 steps, first to 27,000 feet, then 15 minutes later down to 25,000 feet. As altitude decreased, the captain further reduced speed to Mach 0.72. This series of adjustments had a direct impact on the aircraft's performance. Lower altitude meant increased drag, which led to greater fuel consumption. At the same time, slower cruising speed meant longer flight time and less benefit from any tailwind assistance. At 14:24, the captain conducted a fuel check. He calculated that upon arrival at St. Martin, the aircraft would have only about 6,000 pounds of fuel remaining, below the company's minimum requirement of 7,000 pounds. As Flight 980 approached St. Martin, the crew remained in contact with the San Juan Area Air Traffic Control Center. Controllers informed them that weather conditions at St. Martin had fallen below landing minimums. Minimums refer to a set of approved parameters established by aviation regulations defining the safe conditions for landing, such as visibility and cloud ceiling. If these standards are not met, the flight may need to hold in a pattern or divert to another airport. The DC-9, as an early-generation jetliner, was equipped with instrument landing capability, including a localizer for lateral guidance and a glide slope system. Therefore, in theory, poor visibility and bad weather alone were not fatal issues for the DC-9. However, at that time, Princess Juliana International Airport in St. Martin did not have an instrument landing system. This was not unusual in 1970. Instead, pilots typically relied on the Automatic Direction Finder (ADF) and non-directional beacons (NDBs) installed at the airport to perform what was called a non-precision approach. In such a procedure, pilots had to fly over the airport, then follow a specified outbound course for a set number of miles before turning inbound again to align with the runway, navigating solely with the guidance provided by the NDB signal. For Flight 980, the expected approach was from the west to land on runway 09. But the ADF could only point to the signal source. It provided no altitude guidance. Therefore, the published minimums for St. Martin were visibility of at least 2 miles, cloud ceiling no lower than 600 feet, and the runway must be visible to the pilots. Under storm conditions, however, attempting a non-precision NDB approach imposed much higher workload and risk. At airports like St. Martin, the approach path came in directly over the Caribbean Sea. With poor visibility, pilots had no ground references to rely on, only the waves beneath them as they descended. When Flight 980 was informed that weather at St. Martin was already below minimum standards, the crew initially decided to divert to San Juan, Puerto Rico, but they eventually changed their minds. At 14:51 local time, they re-evaluated the fuel situation and concluded that they could still turn back to St. Martin with an estimated 4,400 pounds of fuel remaining upon arrival. However, this decision came at the cost of additional fuel burn, planting the seeds of the tragedy that would soon unfold. At one point, Flight 980 was handed over to St. Martin Tower Control. The tower reported that conditions had improved, now meeting the minimum weather requirements, visibility of 4 miles, and a higher cloud ceiling. This updated weather report seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, suggesting the crew might not have to abandon the flight. In addition, the pilots may have been influenced by a natural psychological inclination, the strong desire to complete the mission and deliver their passengers safely to the destination. This motivation may have further shaped their judgment. Thus, Flight 980 turned back once again towards St. Martin, descending to 2,500 feet. At 15:08, St. Martin Tower updated the crew. Current visibility was 2 to 3 miles, with a cloud base at 800 feet. This was still within the minimum requirements, though showers were reported along the approach path. But there was a serious problem. The weather data was based on observations from the east side of the airport, while the aircraft was approaching from the west side, where conditions were far worse. On that side, there was torrential rain, with visibility near zero. By this time, the DC-9 had descended to 2,500 feet, with fuel remaining for only about 30 minutes of flight time. And yet, the pilots had not even begun their first landing attempt. At 15:18, the pilots initiated their first approach. They configured the aircraft for landing. Flaps set to 25 degrees, landing gear extended, and the DC-9 descended to just 600 feet above the sea. During this approach, the pilots of Flight 980 were able to make visual contact with the airport. However, they failed to adjust their heading in time to properly align with the runway. The aircraft was in an unstable condition, forcing the crew to execute a go-around. After this failed attempt, the captain attempted to circle the airport, executing a left-hand holding pattern in order to realign for a second attempt. In total, he circled the field 3 times. But with heavy rain lashing the windshield, visibility remained extremely poor, and the crew was unable to line up with the runway. Flight 980 went around once more, entering the holding pattern again. By 15:30, the crew made a third attempt to land. This time, the captain managed to align with the runway, but faced another problem. The approach was unstable. The aircraft was too high and too fast, and once again, the crew had no choice but to go around. By this point, the 3 approaches had consumed 11 minutes of precious flight time. Throughout these attempts, the aircraft had been flying with flaps at 25 degrees and engines at high power settings, a configuration that dramatically increased fuel consumption. After the third go-around, only 2,200 pounds of fuel remained, enough for just 18-20 more minutes of flight. At 15:31 local time, The crew abandoned their efforts to land at St. Martin and instead decided to divert to St. Thomas, more than 100 miles away. As they neared St. Thomas, air traffic control handed Flight 980 back to the San Juan Area Control Center. At this point, the first officer quickly performed another fuel check, estimating that they still had 2,600 pounds remaining. But this figure was inaccurate. Taking into account fuel burned earlier in New York while operating the auxiliary power unit and other miscellaneous factors, the true remaining fuel was closer to 2,200 pounds. At this point, Flight 980 had already begun its diversion towards St. Thomas, flying over open ocean. At 15:33, the pilots finally realized that the fuel situation had become critically urgent. The crew was instructed to maintain 4,000 feet due to conflicting traffic, but the captain immediately called over the radio. "Can't you let us climb higher? Any altitude you can give us. I don't have much fuel. I need to climb." The captain's request may have been motivated by two reasons. Either he wanted to climb to a higher altitude to improve fuel efficiency, or he hoped that by being higher, the aircraft would have a longer gliding distance once the fuel ran out. Either way, he knew that staying at low altitude would only accelerate the fuel depletion. Air traffic control cleared Flight 980 to climb to 12,000 feet. The captain began to gently advance the throttles, initiating a slow climb. But ironically, this gradual climb consumed even more fuel than a rapid climb would have. By now, the aircraft had less than 1,000 pounds of fuel remaining, virtually eliminating its chances of reaching the airport. When the low fuel pressure warning lights illuminated, the captain activated the boost pumps and opened the crossfeed valves, trying to stabilize the fuel supply. In the cockpit, the conversation shifted to a grim question. Did they still have any chance of making it to St. Thomas? But the airport was still more than 90 miles away. After weighing the options, the captain made his decision. They would attempt a ditching at sea. He then radioed San Juan Air Traffic Control, "I may have to ditch in the water." Flight 980 now had no other options. With fuel exhausted, a ditching at sea became their only chance. Because the cockpit public address system was inoperative, the captain could not make announcements directly to the cabin. Instead, he used a flashlight signal to call the purser into the cockpit. The captain informed the purser that a water landing might be necessary and instructed him to prepare the cabin. The purser returned to the cabin, joined the two other flight attendants, and together they began the ditching preparations. They instructed passengers to put on their life vests and reviewed the emergency evacuation procedures. Using the cabin PA system, they demonstrated how to wear and inflate the life jackets. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere quickly became chaotic and tense. Some passengers struggled to remove life vests from under their seats. Others could not figure out how to open the packaging, let alone put them on. And some simply refused to believe that a ditching was actually going to happen. They still trusted that the pilots would land them safely at an airport. With no direct announcements from the cockpit due to the broken PA system, the cabin was filled with confusion and unease. At the front of the cabin, inside a coat closet, was stored one of the aircraft's life rafts, one of 5 rafts carried on the DC-9. The other 4 were stowed in overhead bins near the overwing exits. Each raft could hold about 25 people, enough to accommodate all passengers and crew. However, due to structural differences between this particular DC-9 and other Harriets, only the raft stored in the coat closet was successfully prepared for use. The rest of the passengers would ultimately have to rely solely on their life jackets, floating in the open sea. At 15:47 local time, Flight 980 had been flying west for several minutes, deeper over the Caribbean Sea. At that moment, the captain confirmed over the radio that Flight 980 was about to attempt a ditching at sea. Upon receiving this message, San Juan air traffic controllers immediately telephoned the local Coast Guard to alert them. Inside the cockpit, the captain knew with absolute clarity that the situation was now beyond recovery. He understood the aircraft would inevitably ditch. Yet, true to his duty as a professional aviator, he still tried to guide the DC-9 as close as possible to St. Croix Island to offer his passengers even the smallest hope of survival. To relay instructions to the cabin, the navigator stepped into the passenger compartment and left the cockpit door open. This was the only crude means of communication available. Flying at just 500 feet above the waves, the captain peered through the windshield, watching the rolling seas rise into view, knowing the end of the flight was moments away. He pressed the seatbelt sign one final time, hoping it would signal the passengers to prepare. But inside the cabin, most had no idea what the light meant in such a context. The captain and first officer stared intently through the cockpit windows, searching for a suitable spot to ditch. If they could spot a ship nearby, they might attempt to land close to it to increase the chance of rescue. But the sea was empty. Nothing but endless water stretched out before them. Drawing on his more than 10,000 hours of flight experience, the captain carefully eased the DC-9 lower and lower. 400 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet. At each step of descent, he drew a deep breath to steady himself. Finally, he brought the aircraft down to just 100 feet above the surface of the sea. As the waves rose up against the fuselage, the aircraft suddenly showed signs of electrical flickering. This indicated that the engines, starved of fuel, were beginning to flame out. The plane started losing power. The captain immediately switched to emergency backup power. Moments later, the engines rapidly spooled down and shut off completely. Inside the cabin, both passengers and crew could clearly hear the engines dying. With the PA system long since inoperative, the captain could not announce instructions for brace positions. All he could do was flash the seatbelt sign 3 times in quick succession. Realizing the impact was imminent, the navigator shouted loudly into the cabin, "Heads down, brace for impact." The captain's right hand reached for the throttle quadrant. He deployed the flaps to 50 degrees, emergency maximum, to squeeze out the last bit of lift from the wings. This dramatically increased drag, slowing the aircraft to just under 100 knots. At 15:49, Antilles Airways Flight 980 struck the surface of the sea. The aircraft initially remained largely intact, at least that's how it appeared. It hit the water at a 45-degree bank angle, but the captain gripped the control yoke and leveled the plane onto the surface. He had accomplished an almost unimaginable feat of airmanship, but it came at a cost. Later investigations into the ditching revealed that the plane's stopping distance on the water was actually shorter than the aircraft's own length. This created a massive deceleration force far beyond what many cabin structures were designed to withstand. Such extreme deceleration was anything but survivable comfort for those on board. At the time of impact, some passengers were standing, and others had not fastened their seatbelts at all. It is worth noting that the seatbelts used then were not the same as the ones we see on airplanes today. In fact, it was because of this very accident that seatbelt design was later reevaluated. Modern aircraft seatbelts feature a metal-to-metal buckle system, secure, durable, and easy to use. But the original DC-9 seatbelts were a combination of fabric straps and metal fittings, incapable of withstanding the massive forces of the ditching. The deceleration at impact far exceeded the limits of those seatbelts, and even the seat structures themselves. Passengers' personal belongings, seat cushions, and even galley equipment were hurled across the cabin. The passengers themselves were thrown violently around by the force of the crash. The cabin was utter chaos. In the cockpit, conditions were similar. The pilots were flung forward during deceleration, but their seatbelts kept them from serious injury. They quickly realized that seawater was rapidly flooding into the fuselage. The DC-9 was beginning to sink. In this desperate post-ditching evacuation, the crew had only a few minutes to act. Due to damage from the impact, the forward main cabin door could not be opened. Flight attendants managed to open the right-hand service door, but a life raft inside had come loose, floating and blocking the exit, making evacuation even more difficult. Passengers panicked. Some opened the overwing emergency exits and escaped onto the wings. The first officer became trapped in the galley area at one point, but was eventually freed with the help of other crew members. Meanwhile, the navigator located a detached emergency slide and inflated it, providing a makeshift flotation device for those in the water.
The captain escaped through the cockpit window, then re-entered the cabin to rescue 2 passengers. In the end, just over 40 people managed to escape the sinking aircraft. Despite the captain's greatest efforts, nearly 20 people remained trapped inside as the DC-9 slipped beneath the sea forever. The survivors watched in horror as the aircraft disappeared into the depths. The wreckage was never recovered for investigation. To this day, the remains of Flight 980 still lie on the floor of the Caribbean Sea. Initially, about 43 passengers survived, but only 41 ultimately lived. 1 passenger died after reaching a hospital in St. Croix. Out of the 63 people on board Flight 980, the accident claimed 23 lives. The NTSB investigation determined that multiple factors contributed to the accident, including severe weather, communication difficulties between the ground and the flight, and inadequate cabin emergency preparations. Investigators ultimately concluded that the root cause of the crash was fuel exhaustion. This was not due to abnormal fuel burn en route to the Caribbean, but simply the result of running out of fuel. Although pilot error was deemed the principal cause of the accident, the investigation also acknowledged the captain's exceptional skill. In stormy conditions, he successfully ditched the DC-9 on water, keeping the aircraft largely intact and demonstrating remarkable airmanship. Though he could not prevent the aircraft from sinking nor change the unforgiving sea conditions, from a purely technical standpoint, his handling was outstanding. Even if some of the crew's pre-ditching decisions remained controversial, the captain's actions after the ditching earned the survivors' respect. Nevertheless, the captain still lost his career. Overseas National Airways dismissed 3 crew members after the accident, and Captain Percy DeWitt never flew again.